of this country and our allies, that is a position that we must take. I will vote yes on the resolution. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Noting the absence of a quorum, the clerk will call the roll. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
We heard Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid talking earlier today on the floor about the Syria resolution that was voted out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Reid saying that there'll be a vote related to that Syria resolution sometime on Friday. And as lawmakers return to Washington to talk about that resolution, we'll have a 2-hour discussion on Syria and the resolution, including your phone calls. We expect that to start at about 4:30 Eastern on C-SPAN. All members of Congress are being offered a briefing on Syria this afternoon, and President Obama will speak to the nation tomorrow night. We'll have live on C-SPAN networks with your calls, as always, someplace on the C-SPAN networks. And outside the White House today, there was a protest, a pro-Assad anti-war protest. We're going to take a look at that now.
Forces who cannot win without the foreign forces intervening. So what we have today is not chemical weapons or democracy, it's for human rights. It's a very simple question. Who will be the masters of Syria? Will it be the Syrian people or will it be the CIA? And we're here as the American people to say only Syria and only Syrians can determine the fate of Syria. Thank you all. I'm going to give the mic to
Mr. President, Armenia is not Syria, and I'm American too. I want to tell you a little story about Armenian when we got genocide from Turkish side. We never seen any against the democracy that you're talking about. We was in peace, in 100% full peace until Jews were working out the street. Don't you know that? First you said we have to teach the Middle East the democracy. We find out the democracy that you applied in Iraq. Don't you know how many people is dying over there every single minute? Mr. President, don't you see that? That's your democracy. And also you told us you're going all the way down to Iraq for chemical weapons. What kind of chemical weapons do you find? Florence or Turkey? Tell me. And today you're telling us, first you said you're going to apply democracy in Syria. If you really want to learn democracy, Assad family will teach you how.
That was some of what was happening outside the White House today. North Dakota Democrat Heidi Heitkamp is saying that she cannot support a Senate measure authorizing military force against Syria. Associated Press writes that in a statement today, the freshman lawmaker is pressing for a diplomatic or alternative approach to the crisis. Heitkamp said that the U.S. should not act unilaterally and needs other nations to prevent the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Heitkamp and Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who also opposes the use of military force, have been working on an alternative that would give Syrian President Bashar Assad 45 days to sign on to an international ban on chemical weapons. That in the Associated Press. Back from the G20 summit in St. Petersburg, Russia, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon briefed reporters today in New York on the ongoing investigation into the use of chemical weapons. Earlier, Syria's foreign minister announced that his country welcomed Russia's proposal to place its chemical weapons under international control. Secretary Ban said he welcomes this idea and is considering urging the Security Council to transfer Syria's chemical weapons to safe places where they can be stored and destroyed.
Should I begin?
Please begin, yes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I returned from the St. Petersburg G20 summit meeting Saturday afternoon, and I felt it was important for me to brief you as soon as I could. Syria dominated the summit meeting in a way no other political development has ever done at the G20 summit. It also dominated all the bilateral meetings I had with world leaders. The main focus was on the allegation of chemical weapons use and the forthcoming report from my investigation team. I have not yet received the report from Dr. Sellstrom, nor do I know what it will contain. But I do know there has been significant speculation regarding a major use of chemical agents on August 21st, leading to the death of hundreds of civilian people. Should this be confirmed by the report from Dr. Sellstrom and his investigation team, then this would be an abominable crime, and the international community would certainly have to do something about it. 2.5 years of conflict in Syria have produced only embarrassing paralysis in the Security Council. Should Dr. Sellstrom's report confirm the use of chemical weapons, then this would surely be something around which the Security Council could unite in response, and indeed something that should merit universal condemnation. I'm already considering certain proposals that I could make to the Security Council when presenting the investigation team's report. There would be a need for accountability, both to bring to justice those who used them, should Dr. Sellstrom confirm their use, and to deter anyone else from using these abhorrent methods of warfare. There would be a need for greater security regarding any chemical weapons stocks. And there remains an urgent need for the international conference in Geneva and the cessation of hostilities. The Syrian people need peace. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me say just a few words about the regular work of the G20 discussions, where there was progress on growth, jobs, food security, trade, and investment. I urge the G20 leaders to put inclusive and sustainable development at the core of their work. In particular, I call for increased commitment on achieving the Millennium Development Goals, accelerating the MDGs, defining a global development agenda beyond 2015, and addressing climate change. I was encouraged by the response from the G20 leaders, and I look forward to building on those discussions during the general debate later this month when leaders come to the United Nations. I plan to brief you in more detail next week about my priorities for that period. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Thanks very much, Secretary General. First question to Pam.
Good morning, Secretary General. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News, and as President of the UN Correspondents Association, I'd like to thank you for the briefing and welcome you back from St. Petersburg on behalf of the association. My question is, there was an announcement this morning by the Russian foreign minister that Russia will press Syria to put the chemical weapons under UN control. And the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, told Charlie Rosen in an interview that he could not even acknowledge that there were chemical weapons in Syria. How do you think an agreement by Russia would come about? Do you know anything about it? And would it lead to Security Council action? Thank you.
Thank you. I have taken note of Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia's remarks just a short while ago in Moscow. And I also took note of Secretary of State John Kerry's remarks earlier today in London. I welcome these ideas. In fact, as I said in my introductory remarks, I have already been considering certain proposals that I could make to the Security Council when I present the investigation team's report. For a number of days already, I have been considering our proposals in particular. I'm considering urging the Security Council to demand the immediate transfer of Syria's chemical weapons and chemical precursor stocks to places inside Syria where they can be safely stored and destroyed. And I urge again that Syria should become the party to OPCW.
Sylviane.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. With the situation right now and the war drums in the region, do you know if there are also diplomats are considering in evacuating the UNIFIL staff in Lebanon? Do you consider that in case of war? Thank you.
We have quite a number of UN staff working in Syria, including international staff and domestic national staff. For UNRWA staff, we have more than 3,000 there, including all of them, almost over 4,500 staff are there. We have been taking very careful necessary preparations and consideration how we should ensure safety and security of UN staff there. We will continue to very carefully monitor the evolving situation. I can assure you that the security and safety of UN staff is paramount, but at the same time there are a lot of humanitarian works which we have to do, delivering humanitarian assistance daily to many people who need our support. And therefore, just I can make it sure that we are making necessary preparations concerning safety and security of our staff.
James.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. If Syria says yes to transferring its chemical stocks to international control, how quickly can you, the UN, respond to take control of those stocks? What's the time frame?
I think that would be a proper way for Syria to agree to these proposals. Then I'm sure that the international community will have a very swift action to make sure that these stocks, chemical weapon stocks, will be stored safely and will be destroyed.
The quorum call will be suspended.
Mr. President, what is the pending business before the Senate?
It is on the motion to proceed to SJ Res 21. The Senate is on the motion to proceed to SJ Res 21.
Which is?
The Syria resolution.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. And is that to that omnibus resolution that I would like to speak. Mr. President, within a few days, the Senate will be called upon to vote on whether to give the President of the United States limited authority to use military action in response to the Syrian President Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people. It is an enormous and grave decision. It is the most serious vote that I can take. When a United States Senator is called upon to authorize America's use of military action or military might, it calls for the most sober reflection, the most due diligence analysis of the facts and the compelling need, because it is a vote that once you vote to authorize the use of military might, you cannot take it back. It's one of the few votes that you can't take back. We can vote on our budget this year, but there's another vote next year. You can vote to confirm a member of the cabinet, but they serve at the pleasure of the president. But once you vote to use military might or military action, it is irrevocable. So I take it very seriously. And I'm going to say to the men and women of our military that we owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. And I think that debt should not only be with yellow ribbons, but I think that we also owe them to do the due diligence to choose the wisest, most prudent course. This is what I've done as I've contemplated my vote on the Syria resolution. I've gone to numerous briefings before Assad used chemical weapons, and I've gone to all of the briefings since then. I participated as a member of the Intelligence Committee in a variety of meetings. I've gone to a classified House and Senate briefing. I've listened carefully to the President, to the Secretary of State, to the Secretary of Defense, and even had the opportunity to sit with the Vice President of the United States in the Situation Room at the White House to go over this situation and what are the options available to the United States of America. But in addition to listening here in Washington, I'm the senator from Maryland. I've also listened to my Marylanders, whether it's been at events and meetings, going around the state, whether it's been to grocery shopping or just being out in the Maryland community. I've also gotten thousands of emails and calls from Maryland constituents, and I want to thank them for their civic engagement. Mr. President, they overwhelmingly oppose military action in Syria. My constituents have spoken loud and clear. They don't want a war. They don't want boots on the ground. They don't want an all-in effort. They don't want to use or expend America's talent and treasure on another military expedition. And they don't want war. And neither do I. Yet the use of chemical weapons, a weapon of mass destruction, grim and ghoulish, mandates a response. The use of chemical weapons flies against all international law and international norms. It is an act that should have consequences, where I believe it surely will happen again in Syria, possibly in Korea, possibly used by Iran. Since the attack, I've been waiting and hoping for a worldwide reaction, because if it's serious enough for the world to be aghast, then it's serious enough for them to respond. I've been waiting to hear from the 189 countries that are signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention. I believe if you sign a treaty or a convention, you sign up for the responsibility that comes with that, which means stop proliferation of the weapons that you've signed against, stop the proliferation of chemical weapons, and also, if necessary, to take action if mandated. I've waited to hear from the Arab League. I wanted to hear from the Arab League, oh, yes, beyond we want Assad to be accountable. I don't know what that means. Hold him accountable. What does that mean? Does it mean that if we use missiles, they will send in Arab men to defend Arab women and children? I haven't quite heard that. I've waited to hear from our allies, and there are a hearty, reliable few that have supported us. Are they going to help enforce the Chemical Weapons Treaty? Are they going to help support the moderates in the opposition? Have they called for a donor conference on refugees? Hello, out there. And then there's the UN Security Council. By the way, I applaud the work of the UN weapons inspectors and the UN's work on refugees, but where is the Security Council? People say, oh, we can't act unless the Security Council acts. 3 times the Assad enablers at the UN, Russia and China, have vetoed every effort to move to a political solution. Vetoed 3 times efforts to move to a political solution. The UN seems paralyzed in this effort. In deciding my vote, I had to be sure that chemical weapons were used by the Assad regime. Mr. President, I was one of 19 senators who voted against going to war in Iraq. I did vote after 9/11 to use lethal action against the Taliban. But when it came to the Iraq war, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I'd reviewed these briefs, and I didn't believe Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. So I voted no, and I was right. But now this time is different, because I truly believe, after extensive briefings and the evidence that has been outlined to members of the Intelligence Committee, I am satisfied that indeed chemical weapons were used in Syria, and I am satisfied that the Assad regime gave the order to do so. There are those who say to me, well, Senator Barb, aren't you concerned about the risk and the retaliations if we take action? You bet I am. I worry about that. I worry about my own country. I worry about our own military. I worry about treasured allies like Jordan, Israel, Turkey. But I also worry about the risk of doing nothing. Because as I weighed this, that I believe that the risk and retaliatory possibilities are the same even if we don't act, because if they don't use them in retaliation against us, there's a very good chance that if we leave it unresponded to, that they'll use them anyway. So there's no guarantee that by doing nothing, the bad guys will do nothing who have chemical weapons. And in fact, I fear that Assad, Iran, and North Korea will be further emboldened. Lastly, I had to review the President's resolution pending that came out of the Foreign Relations Committee, modified, and the President's plan. The President's plan is very straightforward. Proposal is very straightforward. A targeted, limited attack. Its purpose is to deter and to degrade. To deter Assad from using those weapons again, and to degrade Assad's capability and capacity to use them. I also listened to the President's promise, and I take him at his word, that any action would not be boots on the ground, that it is not an extended air campaign, that it is neither Iraq or Afghanistan, that we're not in it to try to do regime change. That must come from the Syrian opposition themselves, and I hope others help do that. It is meant to deter the use of chemical weapons and to degrade Assad's capability. I believe the President's plan is the best response to protecting U.S. security interests in the region and to show commitment to our common security interest with allies like Turkey, Jordan, and Israel. Therefore, Mr. President, after really great reflection and as much due diligence as I could do, I want to announce today to my colleagues and most of all to the people of Maryland who supported me that I will support the President's request for a targeted, limited military action against the Syrian President Bashar Assad's regime in response to the horrific, grim, and ghoulish use of chemical weapons. Let me be clear. I have no grand hopes or illusions about what this strike will do. I don't believe that this strike will stop Syria's brutal civil war. I don't believe a strike will stop Assad from being a ruthless, brutal dictator. I do not believe that a strike will eliminate all of his chemical weapons. But I do believe that it will deter and degrade his capacity to strike again. And I do believe that when you sign up for a convention to ban the use of chemical weapons, that the United States of America acts with its responsibility. Syria is one of the toughest foreign policy issues that we have focused on. There aren't many good options, yet I believe that the President's plan is the best way, and as of this moment, the only way forward. He has my support. And in today's late-breaking news, I understand Russia has now said, oh, let's put these weapons under international control. Well, where were the Russians during the UN Security Council during those 3 other occasions? Is this another tactic for delay? Is this just another tactic to enable Assad to have more time to focus, I remain skeptical. But I will leave that to the President to analyze the Russians' intent and what their follow-through is on that intent. Today, it is not to mandate the strike. My vote does not mandate a strike. What my vote is to say, Mr. President, you are the Commander-in-Chief. We can only have one at a time. You analyze the situation, and if you think it is necessary to protect the security of the United States of America and to fulfill our responsibilities under the conventions that we have signed on chemical weapons, you have my support to act in what you think is the best way and the best interest. Mr. President, I look forward to additional debate with my colleagues and also furthering this debate and coming to a closure hopefully this week. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, let you know that they're expected to take up debate on 2 judicial nominations at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, about an hour from now, and to have a vote on those nominations at 5:30. Also, just an update on Syria from the floor of the Senate earlier. Majority Leader Harry Reid said he blames the Syrian government for using chemical weapons. He called it a clear violation of human decency. And he said failure of the United States to respond would, quote, embolden hostile forces worldwide. Now, the Obama administration is blaming the Syrian government for a chemical weapons attack last month that killed more than 1,400 civilians. Hillary Clinton also spoke earlier. She endorsed President Obama's efforts to get congressional approval for a military strike in Syria. And while we're in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, we'll take a look at the White House briefing from earlier today.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being here. We wanted to wait for Ambassador Rice to finish her remarks before starting this briefing. Today I have with me at the top of this briefing the President's Deputy National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, whom many of you know. Tony's here today because while many of us were traveling last week with the President, Tony and other senior administration officials were engaged in the effort to provide detailed information to members of Congress about the chemical weapons attack in Syria on August 21st. He was a part of a group that provided classified briefings to, I believe, 185 members of the House and Senate, and is engaged in the overall outreach effort that so much of the administration is participating in now. So what I'd like to do is ask Tony to provide to you at the top here a summation of the presentation that he's making together with other officials, and then he can stay and take a few questions, and then I've got to let him go continue that effort, and I'll take your questions on Syria and other matters after that. With that, here's Tony Blinken.
Jay, thanks very much. Good afternoon. Since the events of August 21st and this use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime against its own people, we reached out almost immediately to members of Congress who at that point were spread across the country, and we sought their views on what we should do. And we heard different views, as you continue to hear today, but one of the things we heard with near unanimity was a desire by Congress to have its voice heard and its vote counted in this matter. And of course the President believes that we're much stronger and more effective if we can act together, especially on matters of national security. So the President went out and made the announcement about his intent to take action, but also to seek Congress's authorization to do so. Since then, we've been engaged in a very deliberate and detailed process of trying to provide Congress all of the information we have so that they can make the best informed decision possible. And as Jay said, we've conducted over the past week or 10 days a series of briefings, many of them classified, some of them unclassified, many conversations as well on an individual basis with members. The classified briefings that I took part in, along with senior officials from the intelligence community, the Defense Department, the State Department, and the Joint Chiefs, I believe had about 185 members, Republicans and Democrats, both houses, take part. And we've had individual conversations coming out of those briefings as well. As we were doing that, we of course were working to build strong international support. The President at the G20 worked on a joint statement on the need to reinforce the prohibition against the use of chemical weapons. At that time, 11 countries, including the United States, signed on. We now have an additional 15 who joined that statement. Secretary Kerry was in Europe as well, working with Europeans and Arabs, and we've been working every day at the United Nations and country by country. But in terms of what we provided Congress, let me just describe the top lines of the briefings. Obviously, I won't get into the classified part. But the bottom line, as we told Congress in these briefings, is that we concluded with high confidence that the Syrian regime used chemical weapons on August 21st with rockets and artillery against its own civilians. We told them that we concluded that well over 1,000 people had been killed, including hundreds of children. We ran through in detail the intelligence that we have, intelligence that shows preparation for the attack, intelligence that shows the attack itself and its effects.
Majority Whip.
I ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, the call will be suspended.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the situation in Syria and the historic choice facing this Congress and America. I've been deeply concerned about the situation in Syria since March of 2011, when thousands of Syrians from all backgrounds peacefully protested for a change in the politics and the economy of their country. I think many of us believe that these peaceful protests would lead to the end of an autocratic Assad regime, just as other despots have fallen in other parts of the Arab world. Yet President Bashar al-Assad, like his father before him, Hafez al-Assad, responded instead with horrific violence to suppress the aspirations of his own people. With the disturbing help of Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran, Assad has managed to hang on to power and to turn his country into a humanitarian nightmare. I've met in my office here in Washington with the Russian ambassador to the United States on this issue. I visited the refugee camps along the Turkish border. I've talked with the moderate Syrian opposition in Istanbul. I discussed this situation with the Turkish President, Mr. Gül, and their foreign minister, Davutoglu, and met with many Chicago area Syrian Americans. I had hoped diplomatic and economic pressure would bring an end to the mayhem and human suffering in Syria. I know the American people feel a responsibility for those overseas in need and those who are struggling to find freedom. But I also know something else about the people of my state of Illinois, and I believe of this country. They are weary of war. And then came the August 21st chemical attack in the suburbs of Damascus in the middle of the night. At that moment, an important challenge was thrown down to the international community. That's not to diminish in any way the violence that's taken place in Syria over the last several years. Over 100,000 have died in that violence. But when it comes to the use of chemical weapons, the world made a decision almost 100 years ago about their use, even in war. How did we reach this international consensus on this horrible weapon? We saw firsthand what it could do. The large-scale use of chemical weapons in World War I killed many and left many maimed and disabled. Many who have some memory of this war, either from a history class or having spoken to someone who served there, understand what it meant. These photos can't do justice to the devastation of chemical weapons and poison gas, but this is a German gas attack on the Eastern Front in World War I. You can see as that gas billowed that the victims were anyone who happened to be in its wake. This is also a photograph of British troops from World War I who were subjected to the poison gas, the chemical weapon of the day, and blinded during the Battle of the Stair in 1918. These photos show just a snapshot of the use of poison gases which don't reach the level of virulence of those used today. Yet maybe even more poignant are the audio recordings of the actual former World War I British soldiers maintained by the BBC for generations so that the experience would not be forgotten. Let me share one excerpt of British troops struggling to cope with the effects of chemical warfare, and I quote, "Propped up against a wall was a dozen men, all gassed. Their colors were black, green, and blue, tongues hanging out and eyes staring. One or two were dead and others beyond human aid. Some were coughing up green froth from their lungs. As we advanced, we passed many more men lying in the ditches and gutterways. Shells were bursting all around." This BBC report goes on to say, "My respirator fell to pieces with the continual removal and readjustment. The gas closed my eyes and filled them with matter, and I could not see. I was left lying in the trenches with one other gassed man and various wounded beings and corpses, and forced to lie and spit, cough, and gasp the whole day in that trench." And another soldier, recorded by the BBC, said, "The faces of our lads who lay in the open changed color and presented a gruesome spectacle. Their faces and hands gradually assumed blue and green color, and their buttons and metal fittings on their uniforms were all discolored. Many lay there with their legs drawn up, clutching their throats." As a result of the horrors of World War I, in 1925, the Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. It was drawn up and signed at a conference held in Geneva under the auspices of the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations. This happened in June of 1925. It became a force of law in February of 1928. Syria was a signatory to this agreement. Let me read the opening of this protocol. It's even relevant today. Quote, "Whereas the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and of all analogous liquids, materials, or devices has been justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world, and whereas the prohibition of such use has been declared in treaties to which the majority of powers of the world are parties, and to the end that this prohibition shall be universally accepted as a part of international law, binding alike the conscience and the practice of nations." Mr. President, what the world was saying in 1925 was clear. These weapons, these chemical weapons, would never, ever be accepted in the civilized world. This message was reaffirmed by the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling, and Use of Chemical Weapons, which went into effect in 1997, and to which almost every country in the world has signed. Almost every country. Those who have not signed: Angola, Egypt, North Korea, South Sudan, and Syria. While not completely taken off the world's battlefields, notably in the case of Iraq, which used poison gas against Iran and its own Kurdish people in the 1980s, the global prohibition against using chemical weapons has been largely upheld for almost a century. That is, until last month in Damascus, Syria. Syria has one of the largest stockpiles of chemical weapons in the world. At our hearing last week, I asked General Dempsey whether the reports which we have from the French were accurate. They reported that the Syrians now have almost 1,000 tons of chemical agents and hundreds of tons of the deadly gas sarin, which has been detected in the pathological investigation of those who were victims on August 21st in Damascus, Syria. Despite all international and warnings not to do so, the Syrian government is literally a superpower when it comes to chemical weapons and has such an arsenal on such a large scale that on August 21st, in the desperation of war, Bashar Assad unleashed these chemical weapons in his own city on his own people. These are horrible pictures of what happened as a result of that attack. I've seen worse. One room with children stacked like cordwood, victims of these chemical weapons. We don't believe it was the first time he's used them, and his father used them before him. But it's the largest scale we've ever seen of the use of chemical weapons by Assad in Syria. Syria has crossed a line that the civilized world said must never be crossed. Not only has the community of nations agreed that such weapons are never to be used, but other regimes with weapons of mass destruction or plans for such weapons, including North Korea and Iran, are undoubtedly watching to see just what the world will do now. Now that Bashar Assad has used chemical weapons in Syria, now that the world has reported it, now that the photos are there for the world to see, now that the pathological investigations are completed, what will the world do? Ideally, there's a place to resolve it, the UN Security Council. But sadly, both Russia and China have said that they will veto not only any effort to hold Assad accountable, they have literally vetoed even efforts to pass resolutions condemning the use of chemical weapons without specificity in Syria. Russia's behavior is incredible and particularly perverse, given that thousands of Russian soldiers were victims of chemical weapon attack in World War I. In May 1915 alone, Russian soldiers on the Eastern Front suffered 9,000 casualties, 1,000 of them fatalities as a result of German chemical weapons. Today I was in the airport in Chicago, and the news was flashing about an overture made by President Putin to try to put an end to this controversy. I, of course, salute and applaud any effort to resolve this the right way, in a verifiable way, and to do it with dispatch. What I understand his proposal to be is that the Syrians will somehow destroy their catch of chemical weapons and, of course, forswear never to use them. That would be a good outcome. But it will be a difficult outcome because investigating with a third party, such as the United Nations, verifying where these weapons are, removing them from Syria in the midst of a civil war is particularly challenging. If there is a way to do this diplomatically, safely, and to do it in a fashion where we can be certain this type of atrocity will not occur again, we absolutely have a responsibility to pursue it. I don't understand how Russia and China can be signatories to the 1925 Geneva Protocols and the Convention on Chemical Weapons and then turn around and protect Syria in the Security Council of the United Nations. If there is one international agency that should be involved in any major diplomatic effort to resolve this peacefully, it should be the United Nations. We should call on Mr. Putin to step forward with the leaders in China and say that they will work with the Security Council to execute any diplomatic policy that can avoid further military confrontation. Until then, make no mistake, President Putin's proposal today And the activities we are seeing and hearing from Syria are a direct result of President Obama's leadership. He has stepped up, even though it's an unpopular position with some in this country, and said that we cannot ignore this red line created by the world when it came to chemical weapons. It is time for others to stand up and join us, to join in stopping the advancement and use of chemical weapons once and for all. I've been listening to this Syria debate, and I can't tell you how many times, Mr. President, I've hearkened back to that time 12 years ago when we debated entering the war in Iraq. It was another one of those votes that come along in the course of a congressional career that keep you awake at night. I was serving on the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. I'd sat through hour after hour after hour of hearings about the suspected weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But it never came together in a credible way as far as I was concerned. There was such a rush to war 12 years ago. 23 of us voted no, 22 Democrats and 1 Republican. And I can recall this scene. It was late at night, after midnight, right here in the well of the Senate, when 3 of us were left. It was Kent Conrad, North Dakota, and of course, from Minnesota, our friend and the late senator who served with so much distinction and spoke out so many times on issues of morals, ethics. And we cast the vote no and waited in this empty chamber. I've thought about that vote so many times. I think it was the right vote to vote no. But there comes a moment in history where we have to stand up as civilized nations and say to those who are willing to ignore the rules and to break the rules that a line cannot be crossed. I hope that we can get that done, not just in the memory of Senator Wellstone and Senator Conrad, but in the memory of so many who have served here and faced these challenges in the past in our history. I hope that we can find a diplomatic solution which will avoid any military use, but I know the reason we have reached this point in diplomacy with this Putin overture has more to do with the President determined to stand up for a matter of principle than almost anything else. We've got to continue to make it clear that we find it unacceptable to use these chemical weapons. We paid a bitter price for the war in Iraq when we were misled as to weapons of mass destruction as a nation. I've seen the evidence in briefings here of this deadly attack in Damascus. I think the evidence is overwhelming and convincing. I think at this point, many Americans are reluctant to even consider the use of military force. So we sat down and drew up a resolution in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. Strict limitations within this resolution about the President's authority and power. 60 days he has to execute a military strategy if nothing else intervenes. 60 days. You can extend it 30 days, but even Congress can object to that if it wishes. He can use military weapons, but only for the purposes specified. No troops on the ground. No troops in combat operations. As Senator McCain said yesterday, that will be part of the law. The President's already said that's his standard as well. So for those who are worried about mission creep and where this might lead us, if God forbid we're faced with that possibility, this resolution strictly limits what the President can do. Mr. President, it was about 8 days ago when I got a phone call at my home in Springfield late on a Sunday night, and a phone call I'll never forget, from the President himself. And we talked for about a half an hour. We talked about a lot of things because we go back a long way. And he talked to me about his thought process and what he's taking under consideration in trying to lead the world in this response to chemical weapons. I was one of the early supporters of this President. I believe in him. I believe in his values. I believe he has been honest with me and with the American people about the situation that we face. I know the options are not good. They never are in these circumstances. But I also know that if we turn our backs on this situation, There will be some dictator in Iran or North Korea who will be emboldened to do even more, to use perhaps not just chemical weapons, but even nuclear weapons. There comes a point when we have to take a stand. And I understand, as people that I represent across Illinois have said to me so many times in the last week, why is it always the United States? Why is it that we have to be involved in this so many times? Why do we have to be the policeman to the world? Well, there's a basic answer there. I'd like to believe that we have values that the rest of the world looks up to. Oh, we've stumbled in our own history. We'll continue to, but we continue to fight for those basic values all around the world. And secondly, if you're in trouble in your country somewhere in the world and you've got one call to make, one 911 call, you pray to God the United States will answer. Because we have the best military in the world. We respond to challenges around the world throughout history, and seldom do we leave a residual power base behind. We go in, we do the job, we come home. That's something you can't say for a lot of nations. It's an awesome responsibility. I think the President's doing the right thing. I think his appeal to the leaders around the world, his appeal to the American people, is consistent with our values as a nation. The President doesn't come quickly to war. He's a person that understands, as I do, the heavy price that has to be paid. And he understands there are moments when a leader, a commander-in-chief, a person with the responsibility of protecting his nation in a dangerous world has to step up and lead. If the United States did not take on this leadership role, I doubt that anyone else would have. I take very seriously the President's promise that he won't be putting boots on the ground in Syria. Mr. President, I've been to too many funerals, visited too many disabled veterans to ever want to see us do that again, except when it's absolutely necessary for America's survival. I think what we're doing this week in the Senate is a step in the right direction, and I believe it's a step that can move us toward a safer world. If we can find, because of the President's leadership, a diplomatic response here that avoids further military conflict but keeps us safe from these deadly chemical weapons, we should pursue it. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in a quorum call here on the Senate floor, we'll let you know that they're expecting to debate 2 judicial nominations at 5 o'clock, about 40 minutes from now, 5 o'clock Eastern Time, and hold a vote on those nominations at 5:30. And also earlier today, we heard from Majority Leader Harry Reid from the Senate floor. He said he blames the Syrian government for using chemical weapons, and he called it a clear violation of human decency. Earlier today, also, the White House briefing. We'll take a look at that now. This is the last 30 minutes or so of the briefing from earlier today.
Your lobbying effort, and specifically, he took exception to Secretary Kerry's remark that the strike would be unbelievably small. He said that was unbelievably unhelpful. Could you explain what Kerry meant by saying it was unbelievably small?
Certainly. I think that Secretary Kerry clearly was referring to that in the context of what the United States and the American people have experienced over this past 10 to 12 years, which includes large-scale, long-term, and as it seemed, at least prior to President Obama coming into office, open-ended military engagements with boots on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. And That is the contrast that Secretary Kerry was making. I don't think that the phrasing reflects.
Senator from Connecticut.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I'd ask the quorum call be dispensed with, and I'd be asked to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection, the quorum call is dispensed with, and the senator is recognized as if in morning business.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Almost all of this week on the floor of the Senate will be dedicated to one of the most serious, if not the most serious, matters that this body ever considers, that of war and peace, the question of whether or not we engage American military assets in conflicts across the globe. And I'm sure I'll be back down here later this week to speak on that weighty matter. And I appreciate Senator from Illinois' I think very passionate speech on this subject. But, Mr. President, almost every week over the last several months when the Senate has been in session, I've come down to the floor to talk about another subject of life and death consequence. That is the growing number of individuals across this country who have been killed by guns. And though we are going to debate life and death here this week as we try to figure out what the course of American intervention may or may not be in a place on the other side of the earth in which far too many people, far too many innocent people, little babies and adults alike are being killed, we can't go weeks without also debating what we're doing here to make sure that American citizens, babies and teenagers and adults right here in the United States of America are being killed. What are we doing to prevent that? So I've brought this poster down, or a variant of it, a couple times a month, every single month since I think about April of this year, and the number is a pretty simple number. It represents the number of people in the United States who have been killed by guns since December 14th. Now, as we get farther away from that date, maybe people forget what it is, but in Connecticut we will never, ever forget what that date means. December 14th was the date in which 20 little 6- and 7-year-old boys and girls were killed inside Sandy Hook Elementary School, along with 6 teachers and professionals that protected them, along with the gunman and his mother. 28 people in all were killed that day. And it has, frankly, lit a spark under the American consciousness about this issue, which has, frankly, been lingering for far too long. 28 people died in Newtown that day on December 14th, but every day across this country, on average, 30 people die due to homicides from guns. And so I'm back here today to try to tell the stories of just a handful of the 7,907 people that have been killed at the hands of gun violence since December 14th. I think when I started back in April, this number was somewhere around 4,000. It has marched upwards, almost doubled since then. This has been a really bad summer in Connecticut, for instance. In places like New Haven and Hartford and Bridgeport, we thought we were making some real progress when it came to the number of homicides by guns, and this summer, unfortunately, we saw far too many. People like Devontae Jackson, 18 years old, who was killed on August 15th of this year in New Haven. He was 18 years old, and he was killed in a drive-by shooting while simply standing on a sidewalk just after 8 o'clock on the evening of August 15th. A friend of Devontae's says, "I don't understand why somebody would do this to him. He's real good. I never knew he had problems with anybody because he was always getting along with everybody." Other friends said he wasn't a bad kid, he was just in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Everybody should know, stop the violence, put the guns down. A few days later in Hartford, at the same nightclub in 2 separate incidences, 2 young men, Miguel Delgado, age 21, and Brian Simpe, age 19, were both killed. Disputes that started in a nightclub that just spilled out onto the streets of Hartford. 2 different disputes, 2 different incidences, and both these boys were killed. Brian was 19 years old He had graduated from Manchester High School. He attended Manchester Community College. He worked at ShopRite in order to make enough money to go to community college. He wanted to start his own business. He was a kid who wanted to do something great with his life. He tweeted before he was heading out that night, "Just another summer night out." Unfortunately, in places like Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport and Baltimore and Chicago and Los Angeles, this is just another summer night out. Too many people being killed simply as a result of common disputes, this time happening in a nightclub in Hartford. Domestic violence, as we know, often unfortunately leads to tragic homicidal incidences. Janice Lesko from Coventry, Connecticut, died on August 24th, just a few weeks ago, from a gunshot wound to the chest. Her husband, who shot her, then committed suicide. Her husband had a well-documented and decade-long history of threats and abuse. Mrs. Lesko was a mother and a grandmother. She had lived in Coventry for most of her life. We luckily have an agreement that people who have a history of domestic violence shouldn't get their hands on a gun. But they can if they walk into a gun shop, if they walk into a gun show, or if they buy their gun on the internet. And we can't simply make the decision here that if you buy a gun online or you buy your gun at a gun show, you should be stopped from doing so if you have a history of domestic violence. And I frankly was just struck by this one newspaper article describing one night in New Haven. This is even earlier, on August 11th, 2013. It starts by talking about Torrance Dawkins, a 22-year-old Waterbury man who was celebrating his birthday in a New Haven nightclub when he was shot and killed at about 1:30 on Sunday, August 11th. But the article goes on and just sort of casually says that later that day, New Haven police responded to more gun violence. A local rapper was putting up sheets of an upcoming concert that he was going to be holding in town, and he suffered a single gunshot wound to his neck. Devon Goodwin, who was 18 years old, was later that day shot in the thigh on Hamilton Street. And just before 5 p.m. that day, police were called to an area near Dixwell Avenue to find out that Jermaine Adams, 41, had received a gunshot wound to his face. Those last 3 people miraculously survived, but you can just see how casual gun violence can be on a summer Sunday in New Haven, Connecticut. One young man died as a consequence of a dispute at a nightclub, and 3 other people luckily survived those wounds who were killed later in the day. Every single day in this country, in the United States of America, 30 people are dying due to gun violence. Almost 8,000 people have died since the tragedy in Sandy Hook, and this body has done nothing to stop it. We've had common sense legislation before the Senate that would just say, you know what, if you have a criminal history, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun no matter where you buy it, at a gun show, at a gun dealer, online. We've had common sense, bipartisan legislation on the floor saying, you know what, it should be a crime to buy a whole mess load of guns from a gun store and then go out and intentionally sell them to criminals. We can't get that passed either. We even tried to just say, let's beef up our mental health system. Make sure that people who have a serious mental illness get the treatment they need so that they don't resort to violence, the very few who do. That was part of the bill that we couldn't get passed. And so, Mr. President, I'm going to continue to come down to the floor to give voices to these victims, to talk about the real people, the stories behind the dozens of people that are killed every day by guns in this country and the 8,000 people who have been killed since Sandy Hook. We're going to make a really, really important decision this week about whether or not we're going to commit military assets to the Middle East. And maybe that debate will stretch into next week and the week after. But we shouldn't forget that while people are dying overseas, people are dying due to gun violence right here in the United States. And before it's too late, before another 8,000 people die from guns in this country, we should do something about it. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.